Our next panel is Indigenous-Led, Nature-Based Solutions in Action. We're very, very happy to have this panel, and I'm happy to welcome Danika Littlechild as the moderator. Danika is a member of the Ermineskin Cree Nation, Niyasquayak, in Meskwakis Treaty 6 territory in Alberta. She's an assistant professor at the Department of Law and Legal Studies at Carleton University, Faculty of Public Affairs. She's a former practicing lawyer in Alberta. Her work has focused on the rights of Indigenous people, the environment, water, conservation, and international law. Danika served as co-chair of the Indigenous Circle of Experts under Canada's Pathway to Target 1, and continues to serve as an advisor to the Assembly of First Nations on environment and water. Danika is excited to work with the Conservation through Reconciliation Project at the University of Guelph in her new capacity as a professor. Please join me in welcoming Danika Littlechild, and she will bring up her panel.
So where are my panelists? Do they want me to do this alone? What's going on?
I could have at least introduced them by name, but I didn't.
Okay, come up here, guys. You got to eventually speak. Okay, so I'd like to first just read out the amazing bios of the panel that you'll be hearing from today. Paul Kariya works for the Coastal First Nations as a senior policy advisor. Prior to this, he had been the executive director of Clean Energy Association of BC, executive director of Pacific Salmon Foundation, executive director of BC Treaty Commission, and held positions within public service of BC and Canada. He makes me feel bad for not being an executive director of anything. Kariya has held academic and teaching positions at Carleton, Simon Fraser, University of Northern British Columbia, and Trinity Western. He has served as an international trustee on the board of AROCA, I'm not sure how to pronounce that properly, and other environmental and community boards, and he has a PhD from Clark University in Massachusetts. Mandy Gull completed a diploma in social sciences from Dawson College in 2005. She also holds 2 bachelor's degrees from Concordia University School of Community and Public Affairs, one in political science and one in community public affairs and policy studies. In July of 2017, Ms. Gull was elected to a 4-year term as Deputy Grand Chief and Vice Chairperson of the Cree Nation government, having served as Deputy Chief of the Cree First Nation of Waswanipi from 2014 to 2017. She also owned and operated her own management consulting business from 2012 to 2014, specializing in working with First Nations communities and organization management. Mandy has always been passionately involved in the fight to protect Cree lands and the management of environmental impact. She has participated and promoted campaigns for the protection of the Broadback River Valley in her previous role, and now, as the Deputy Grand Chief, has the opportunity to work on planning and developing a protected areas network throughout EOSG. And Diandra Bruised completed the Renewable Resources Management Program from Lethbridge College and subsequently attained a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Sciences at the University of Lethbridge. Diandra had worked as a junior forest ranger, crew leader, forestry technician, and wildlife technician, and she found her passion in the outdoors and mingling with trees. As a Blackfoot woman, she aimed her studies on traditional ecological knowledge and the importance of protecting native environments from an eco-spiritual perspective. She served as the Kainai First Nation as the climate change coordinator since 2017, and through her training in classical Western science, the projects she has worked on aim to braid traditional knowledge into climate change policy. She helped to organize the Kainai High School Earthwatch Stewardship Club and advocates for youth environmental education and connection to land, and she's a member of the Kainai Ecosystem Protection Association and has graduated from the Alberta Climate Leadership Program. And she's also a fellow with the Energy Futures Lab and a board director with Alberta Environment Network. So please join me in welcoming your wonderful panel. Our gratitude for your presence here. Thank you. So Paul, we'll begin with you. You have 10 to 15 minutes.
There we go. Well, good morning. Good morning, and thanks for the introduction. I too want to begin by acknowledging the traditional territories we're on of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe-Aski people. I want to thank the hosts for putting this on. I also want to thank colleagues here on the panel and look forward to a good discussion. I asked some of our chiefs and leaders to be here instead of myself. I think we as an organization have a policy that Indigenous leadership should be at the forefront of these, and they would have come, but our communities, for those of you who know where we're located, are quite far away in distant places from Vancouver and that. And I talked to a couple of our chiefs, and they just said, we're exhausted. We've been in Vancouver a lot, Paul, and so in that sense, you've got the hired help. There are many stories we can tell, and as a staffer with Coastal First Nations, a report that I could give in terms of nature-based solutions, but today the topic is about carbon credits, and I look forward to maybe blowing through these slides and getting to the Q&A part of this, which would be far more interesting. The map is hard to read. I think the summary of the 9 communities, the 8 nations that comprise Coastal First Nations are located, and their territories are located north of Vancouver Island up to the Alaska Panhandle, including Haida Gwaii. The mandate of Coastal First Nations, and our incorporated name is Great Bear Initiative, is to protect the environment and, second, to enable sustainable economic development. We get asked to be pulled in by the nations themselves to all kinds of things, but the chiefs have said that our mandate is fairly limited, as broad as it is, and we don't get involved in housing and some of the many issues that occur in Indigenous communities today. Most of you have heard of the Great Bear Rainforest. Many of you here in this room have been involved in that campaign in the past, from 10 years ago, 6 years ago, serving on boards today, whether it's the Coast Opportunities Fund, whatever. And on behalf of our leadership, I thank you for that, because it is a partnership, it is collaboration that has been mentioned earlier that has brought solutions to the table. We aren't, in terms of the Great Bear Rainforest, we're not all of the nations represented. There is another group of nations on Vancouver Island that are part of this too, and they're not represented in CFN, but we are the majority of the nations. As the title suggests, it's more than about trees, and it's more than land use, and it's more than stewardship. It's all of those. It includes the marine, and it obviously includes the people involved in the nations. I mentioned earlier that one could talk about other stories, and some of you have heard about the grizzly bear ban in BC. One could talk about the historic fish agreement that's been not publicly spoken about, but I'll just drop a tease here that when Minister Wilkinson was the fisheries minister last July, we signed a commercial fish reconciliation agreement. I'd love to talk about that more, coming from a fishing background, but maybe that's another story. But it will see First Nations that have been disenfranchised from the commercial fishery over the next 15 to 20 years back in artisanal fisheries, back in small boats, and families being able to gather and participate in the fishery. And this artifice that's existed over the last 30 years or so of can't be food fishing if you're commercial fishing, and that's going to disappear. And in return, what Canada gets is every fish caught will be counted. That's a commitment that the nations make. Personally, for me, it's coming back to where I started my career 40 years ago, and it's a real joy to work for the CFN. It's not easy. It's maybe the toughest gig I've had, but it is like coming home, and kind of neat to see some of the leadership still involved after 40 years. Unfortunately, many have passed on, but it's a wonderful opportunity. Getting to the subject at hand then, we have carbon credits, the nations do, because of what's happened in terms of land use and forestry. In simple terms, taking the annual allowable cut from a level like this to here, and I can't remember the percentages, but
let's say in the high 70s down to the 30s, that delta generates the carbon credit. And we have a lot. We are arguably Canada's largest forest-based carbon credit seller. And it's because of our carbon credits, largely, there are others who provide to the British Columbia government, but largely because of the Great Bear, largely because of CFN nation's carbon credits, that the BC government can crow that it's carbon neutral. We are in renegotiations with them right now on the next 5-year agreement to purchase carbon credits. Maybe a message I'd leave here, and one that is kind of lost in our negotiations with the province right now. I have to say, without too much rancor or criticism, I thought the negotiations with the NDP government would be a lot easier than they have been, because the carbon credit regime was established under the previous Liberal government. But it hasn't been easy, and I think the key thing that government forgets in BC with a new cast of people is that this was under reconciliation. There's a series of agreements that have cast this, and cotton legislation, this was a reconciliation agreement. Government, in simple terms, was saying, we'll do this, but we don't have the finances to follow through. And guess what? Mutually, the carbon credit model was born, and carbon credits pay for reconciliation. I guess maybe what I'd ask you as an audience is, most of you, many of you, traveled here on some kind of combustion vehicle. And I guess at this summit I'd ask, what are you doing to offset your footprint? And if you can answer that by offsetting through a purchase of carbon credits, great. If you can't, why don't you call us? Why don't you call me, and we can sell you some carbon credits. And it's a gentle chuckle in the room, but I'm dead serious. We are in a struggle to continue the work we do. It's Guardians and Stewardship, and we have 150 people employed in the nations under our Guardian Stewardship program, and we need to finance that. And while I renegotiate the agreement with British Columbia, and we've got corporate interests that are interested, I got to sell a ton of carbon credits, literally tons of carbon credits to you. And so if you've got organizations that want to offset, come and see us. I didn't really want to use this as a platform to sell, but in talking to our president yesterday, that was her message to me, is don't come home empty-handed. And this is part of the tussle with the provincial government, because the province sees the granting, and that's the term they use, of carbon credits under agreement to the nations, and the nations don't see that that way at all. These are their carbon credits, where rights and title exist. It's not granted from the province at all, and the nations see this as their own source revenue. Yes, we're quite successful in getting government funding. We've been quite successful in working with partners in this room in terms of foundation funding, but this is own source revenue. And the window of opportunity is probably not that long. We too don't want to see a carbon credit market exist for a long time. We want to get to other solutions. And our next long-term phase is probably electricity generation. And we've got plans for a Northern Power Authority, cotton legislation, potentially owned by First Nations, and we see a long-term future doing that. In the meantime, it's carbon credits that I have to sell. Thanks very much.
Nista mai nginu yemen, mushas no inuktan ashke nyanga tandeochiat ndimonan, admuk enishdo and jibajin setstodo. Nashka no inaskamaga chemendo jimigwik mean beg jisgao jejidaikot nahao. So my opening statement is in my Cree language because I believe it's my duty to continuously show that we speak Cree fluently, and I said I will do so even though I believe there's probably only 2 people in the room that understand me. And I also give thanks for this beautiful day that we're blessed with a new day to be here. My name is Mandy Gall. I'm the Deputy Grand Chief of the Cree Nation of USG. We're the James Bay Cree of Quebec. It's a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to share a story of USG. It's nice to see some old friends, some partners, and to meet new people during my time here. A lot of the information yesterday was a major takeaway for me. I've learned a lot being here too, so I really appreciate the opportunity. I bought a PowerPoint. I was not smart enough to print out my PowerPoint like Ron did, so I will be leaning to struggle and see my PowerPoint a bit on the side. I'm going to be speaking today about one of the projects that we launched in the Cree territory. Thank you, I appreciate that. I am from Iwishchi, which literally the translation is Land of the Cree. We are a nation of 20,000 members. There are 10 communities. We are essentially self-governing. We manage our own governance system. We have our own government. We have our own elected officials. We manage our own education system, health, policing, justice. Thank you. Oh, you're so kind to do it all the way. I am previously a forest campaigner trying to protect my community's trapline system. I come from a community that has 63 traplines. We have many members that continue to hunt, fish, and trap and live on their traplines full-time throughout the year. I come from a family where my husband is a hunter, so 90% of my diet is wild meat. It's very important to me to ensure the health and beauty of Iwishchi. And I had the opportunity when elected at a regional level to work on a file where we were developing a protected areas network throughout our territory. And we really based this on the Cree conservation strategy. We had a number of items that we had identified of importance to our culture and to our practices. I'm not going to read through them all, but we had a number of members that sat with us. We engaged everybody that we could on every single level. Our youth are highly motivated and involved in many of our regional files. Input from our elders, input from our CTA, the Cree Trappers Association. And this was really a framework that we used when we were announced the Plan Nord coming into Quebec. The Crees kind of prepared themselves for this new provincial developmental approach, and we stated that our priority was conservation and protection before economic development. And this was many years ago. I think this document came out almost 15 years ago. But it is something that was built through consultation from the people, and we were very proud to work with it. So there are 8 key factors. For us, interconnectivity is a major position. Our territory is extremely large, over 300,000 square kilometers, the size of a small European country. We also look at wildlife population. We are very dependent on specific species that are the majority of our diet, so things like wetlands. Geese is a major portion of the diet. We also eat a lot of moose and caribou. We do work very hard to deal with the issues surrounding the caribou in our territory. Our territory is heavily impacted by forestry and mining, so we do a lot of work to try to really ensure that moving forward, the health and the benefit to the wildlife population through conservation is in place. We want to ensure full participation of Cree at the table. We also want to ensure that our knowledge and our cultural information and our cultural practices are incorporated throughout that process. We want to build Cree capacity. I'm very impressed by my colleagues' bio here. You know, we are starting to see a lot of youth coming into this space, and I always encourage our youth to go back to school and to pursue environmental studies. And we are starting to really look into climate change. And I think this had been a discussion that we were not maybe 10 years ago as vocal about, but I think this has really become one of the hot topic issues in our community. We had a climate change forum. We now have a position paper on climate change. So we really try to incorporate all of these things when looking at our planning. Currently, we have 15% of the territory that's protected. We've been doing this work for a number of years. Quebec, of course, we have a very close working relationship with Quebec. We have a nation-to-nation agreement. We are looking to succeed in successfully protecting 20% of that area and then an additional 30% in non-industrial development. So I have an incredible team. Our coordinator for protected areas went to every single community and did consultations for the first part of the protected areas. We've been building up that team. I have a staff member here today, Flora Wishchi. She also traveled throughout the communities and got input through a consultation process with not only community members, but local elected officials, trappers, anybody who wanted to be part of this process. We really want to ensure that the foundation of the work that we do is built on the knowledge of our people. This is what our territory looks like. When we did our protected areas network, we pursued to incorporate science and traditional knowledge. And I think that this is one of the most unique projects that I've heard about in Quebec. I drool when I look at the Coastal Network Carbon Credit Program, because I hope that this is something that we'll incorporate into our project. But our territory is divided into trap lines, and we wanted to ensure that the cultural data, the heritage sites, the areas for camps, for traditional portages, were in essence the key components to our protection. We also married that with watersheds. So we looked at water sources. We have a lot of water in our territory, so we wanted to be sure that headwaters were protected, that major riverways were protected. And then we also, through partnership with NCC, looked at different kinds of information. Too many to go through, but we measured watersheds, we measured impact, we measured development in the territory, human footprint. We looked at wetlands, climate projections. They really worked with a lot of information. I think we almost, drove our staff into the ground doing this project. They really, really committed themselves. I think NCC, the work that they've done with us, I'm very appreciative of it. I'm very, very appreciative of it. Everybody really contributed to this so much. And we were able to successfully submit to Quebec over 60,000 square kilometers. We're now in a negotiation process where we are looking to really refine that. Of course, this is a dialogue between our nation and the government, so there are expectations on both sides. We are also looking to secure caribou protected areas. I'm sure everybody in the room is well aware of what's happening with the caribou in the boreal forest. We are part of that struggle also. We're going through a negotiation process right now where recently we've announced an infrastructure development plan in our territory, and we have included protected areas as part of that because we want to ensure that whatever areas our communities have identified are maintained in the development process. And I think for me, personally as a politician, sometimes that's very challenging. There are days when I think, there is a need for employment for my members, and then there are days where I kind of wonder what that will mean 25, 30 years in the future, but this is the risk that you take when you're governing. You want to try to adjust the needs of your people. You've heard many people say protected areas are in areas that are extremely north, hard to get to. We are in that boat as well. We have incorporated in our planning a program for guardians too. Our vision is to ensure that these protected areas are in place, that we have our members giving cultural training, teaching about long-term projects that the Crees run, showcasing our wildlife, showcasing the food sources that we work with, and really showcasing the relationship that we have with water. We are, one nation, but we are both terrestrial, and we both make use of our shorelines in James Bay. We have a very close relationship with the caribou, and I think this is one of the things that has really been a hot topic issue for us. We are really pushing hard. I think Quebec is really trying to identify and plan where they want to go with this. We have a new government that was elected, completely new, has never been in office before. So seeing them try to evolve and determine the direction where they want to take their government has been interesting, but also challenging at certain times. Our landscape varies across the territory, everything from boreal forest to subarctic tundra. We depend on our relationship with so many types of wildlife. That's why we really try to encapsulate every type of landscape that we can into our protected areas. There are threats, as I mentioned. We have a lot of forestry activity and mining. I come from a community where 90% of our trap lines have been impacted by forestry and mining. There's 10% left intact. This is the Broadback River Valley. This is one of the old growth forests left in Quebec. There are two, but this is one of the largest ones. So I campaign very hard to ensure protection of that. There is continuing ongoing dialogue. I think everybody understands that this is not a quick turnaround time process. You really have to ensure that the case that you build is a strong one. And for us, it's really about showcasing, yes, we've had a lot of development in our territory. There's been a lot of impact. There's been the creation of dams. There's been the creation of many different types of development projects. But we really try to continue to stress our relationship with the territory and unfortunately, sometimes that means trying to harmonize our activities around certain things. I had the opportunity to share in an orientation session that for me, it was completely normal to grow up in, a trap line that has been heavily impacted by forestry, seeing people come in, tree planting, large trucks, and then having the opportunity to be in trap lines that have been completely untouched, just absolutely changed my life and really played a very strong influence in how I try to represent my members. My priority is in the environment. I think that's very rare to see a politician who really dedicates like 75% of her time working on environment, but it's because I'm very proud of my culture. I'm very proud of the Cree Nation. And I think that, I've said this to many people, I do believe that reconciliation through conservation is a major ticket to success. I think that goes for all of the nations across Canada. I strongly encourage you. I've heard many times here throughout the event about having Indigenous people tell their story. And, I challenge you to go beyond that. Because if you really ask who here in this room is Indigenous and is working in protected areas, I think maybe only less than 10 people would stand up. So I challenge you as NGOs, as associations, as communities, as municipalities to continue that relationship building process. Reach out, try to find out what is the issue in your nearby community, in your nearby nation. Build those relationships because that means reconciliation. And especially when you're building those relationships through conservation and protection, you are reaching the highest level of reconciliation. There are many calls to action in the TRC, but I really believe this is one of the most important ones. Thank you.
Thank you to my colleagues up here. That was very powerful. Gi, I damig shiskanatani, ni stoako ki dum saugatsi. Nimktoto agano, nimkto si tabi mamioix, gi agapu gax. Ninna honestau atsko machgano, gi ningshist honestau, nato saki. So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Idum Saugatsi, but my colonizer name, they call me Diandra Bruised. I'm here I cheated a little bit. I brought a video today that we're gonna queue up and I'm gonna talk a little bit after that. I guess before the video, I actually wanted to acknowledge the territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people that we're on here today, and I also want to acknowledge the fellow Indigenous people who are here in this room today. We all know that there were barriers and there were challenges that our ancestors had to get through for us to be able to be here today. So I really want to acknowledge that. Let's cue up the video.
People are concerned about with like climate change sessions, with the work you're doing, with the students, and food security stuff. It kind of all relates to grassland too. That's where we get our foods, our traditional plants.
The grassland project it ties into a few projects, but we're looking at protecting and restoring the remaining tracts of grasslands on the Blood Reserve.
You can start looking at where the grasslands start in the southwest part of the reserve. This is where they start. This particular area is really not healthy. And what's happening, all of this is starting moving to the grasslands area. So we have to stop it. I need to do it because I live up here. This land needs to heal. Like a lot of people, you can't start anything until you heal.
I think people don't understand when you disturb something that it's going to take decades even to come back.
Make sure this land's healthy and here for our people for a long, long time.
So our native grasslands here in southern Alberta, we have very fertile soil. It's dark brown tranexamic soil. It's a soil zone that we occupy here. A lot of settlers came and wanted to cultivate land and till the land. So they wanted to take out the native grasslands and just replant it with horticultural species. So just to profit off it, right? well, we got rid of so much of our native grassland without thinking about it. Like, we just had dollar signs in our eyes and not thinking about the long-term effects it actually had on us. And so now, like, majority of our native grasslands are now gone. And those native species that rely on native grasslands for habitat and food, they can't survive in cultivated land. Like, you won't see, like, burrowing owls, prairie rattlesnakes, sharp-tailed grouse, all of our at-risk grouse species, a lot of our at-risk bird species, yeah. Basically all of our bird species can't survive in cultivated land, so they need that native grassland, and they need large plots of it, and so there's not really a lot of habitat connectivity anymore.
A lot of our medicines, traditional plant medicines, come from our grasslands. And due to the way we've overgrazed, certain plant species have become harder to find, or almost we can't find them on our main reserve. We have to go elsewhere.
Well, grasslands are, not a lot of people know this, but they're a highly endangered ecosystem. And the grasslands themselves are a very important carbon sink. And so if we lose these grasslands, we're also going to be losing that carbon sequestration ability.
You know, we're here to take care of it. Not only have we been colonized though, we're doing that to the land or our plants and birds, especially hawks. You see them flying. Like, they don't find anything to a wheat field. So they got to go through miles and miles of wheat field for them to hit a pasture, and that's where you can find something. Because the more the land you give back, the more all of these animals have a chance. When I go out and people ask me to talk with them, like either in a classroom or around the field, one of the things that I mentioned to them is about, when you go out on the land, it's not just grass. But when you start introducing them to things they can actually eat, that they can use, that's where the interest comes in. Wouldn't it be sad if this was to disappear? And that's where I tell them that, this is what we got to do. Because from when we were put here by the Creator, this is what we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And the land too it's it's a living thing. When a lot of people when they talk about warriors, there's a lot of components to being a warrior. We're still warriors today, but the main thing that was important to the warriors back then that we were told by the chiefs was you got to take care of the land, because that takes care of the people. We knew our land. We knew every part of it. We knew what had to be burnt, we knew what had to be fixed, we knew what had to be left alone. So that's how we traveled all over the place to get to different things, for us to survive. And just within this small piece of land, there's a lot of things that it offers. You can go and, you can get on sage and whatever sweetgrass they can collect, double root.
Our land base is quite big and our field staff is small, so we need the help of our membership to help us monitor and help us document the changes or the health of our ecosystems on our reserve. So invasive species of all types are slowly encroaching or have encroached on our reserve and are slowly taking over. We need to better watch what we're putting into the environment and taking from it, and we need to start giving a damn.
It's possible, like anything's possible if we have a transition period and a plan.
Our medicines, the way we pick, we just rip the roots out and over harvest.
And within that too, we have our responsibilities to take care of it, or we have our different, our seasons to collect and harvest. We have a certain period of time where we burn the grass to renew it. And that was also used to entice the buffalo to come back to a certain area.
We should be able to go back year after year to certain sweetgrass patches, but because people just pick and pick and pick our mint patches, and then they're gone once they're overpicked, and that root system or seed bank is not there, then we have to start managing, we have to start growing them and start planting them.
We need to adapt, because if we keep, following our practices, like we're going to run out of our plants, because these are the first things that are being affected from climate change. So we can't just sit around and not do anything. We can't be idle anymore. We got to get up and do it. So this is what we're doing.
Stock we need to be is like key to our culture. It's what makes us unique. What ties us to this land is our connection to our grasslands, to our trees, to our water. If it's not there, then our culture is going to have to adapt into a contemporary, which I don't see. So if we're more cognizant of what we're doing to the land and try to take a step back and be less hard on it, a smaller footprint, and just try to protect and save what we can and help our land. So what we need to do is help it, not take from it the way we've been.
Thank you. It was important to me to bring that video to the room today to really showcase that what happens on First Nations reserves is not by one single person, it's by many people connecting. The project that we're talking about is a grassland restoration project. William Singer III, the radical-looking guy with the long hair, his land was tilled for farming by his father and his grandfather, but he's really working hard to restore it. And as we know, within grassland restoration, it's going to take a really long time. And that's the thing with having the citizen doing it with our help, is we understand that we are committed to this project. We are committed to the grasslands. And it was important to showcase how important our landscape is to us. It's more than just the benefit of sequestering carbon. We didn't even talk about carbon. We don't have any carbon economists on our reserve. It was about food security. How are we adapting to climate change? And then within these conversations, we are understanding that everything connects. When we talk about grasslands, our reserve is also talking about bringing back the buffalo. That's something that we're losing in this conversation when we just keep it to one narrow carbon. Buffalo and other animals on the landscape help facilitate what we do, help facilitate the work that we do. Humans were placed on this earth with animals. We co-evolved together. The way we keep our language, we keep it separate. We live on this earth. There are places that, we're in nature, but nature's fenced off. We don't get to interact with it. And these are just some things that I'm sure we all notice in our day-to-day lives. I'm sure we all yearn to continuously feel that connection every day. I know I do, sitting in the office behind a computer, talking about climate change, seeing all these disasters and crises and emergencies, and you just want to save it for the sake of it being land, of it being where my ancestors came from. So we work really hard to really bring back our native grasses and our soil, our animals, and our people. We talk about that we're losing biodiversity. I saw a poster out in the poster foyer talking about conserving Amazon forests, and they're working with the Aboriginal people, but we're not talking about conserving the Aboriginal people. We keep talking about Indigenous knowledge as if it is a backup to what we are doing. But we have to stop treating it like a backup plan. I'm not done. Moving forward within our projects, we have we always continuously apply for grants, for project funding. To be fair, what my colleague Alvin said on the video, there are very few of us field staff within the Environmental Protection Division. There's only 3 full-time permanent employees, and I am not one of them. And yet we expect to work on the largest reserve in Canada. We have our own unique challenges and issues, but we keep pushing forward. The Guardians program, man, we see it work, and it works. But where are the IPCAs within grasslands, knowing that 75% of Canada's species at risk depend on the grasslands? Thank you.
I'm so pleased to hear all your amazing messages today. And I thought there were some incredibly important themes that all of you raised. And I think, of course, the obvious one is connectedness. But I feel like connectedness has become a bit of a byword, and a lot of people have difficulty sort of operationalizing the concept in the work that they do and understanding how it functions. And I think part of it is about responsibility, which often gets lost in the conversation when we talk about, some of the narratives that come up in nature-based solutions. And, part of the challenge for us moving forward, I believe, is that as we understand sort of a shift to nature-based solutions as one possible avenue, it's important that we not perpetuate the continued peripheralization of Indigenous peoples and their perspectives and their diverse experiences. And I think, so for example, if we talk about valuation of nature-based solutions, which is something I wanted to raise yesterday, we talk about valuation. If we try to get to a common valuation system, in all likelihood, it won't include Indigenous perspectives of valuation, because it's incredibly inconvenient, to be honest, to include Indigenous perspectives, because we are so diverse and because there's a lot of different systems out there, as you've heard today. But I think we have to commit ourselves to doing the hard work here. That's what this is really about. If you want to talk about reconciliation, if you want to talk about bringing Indigenous knowledge systems into the conversation, you have to be willing to slog it out with us. And that is not going to be quick, and it's not going to be convenient. But that's the reality. And I think a lot of people think of reconciliation as some kind of magical finish line, but actually it's really hard day-to-day relationship building, as was mentioned. I think the other thing I wanted to mention was that we also have to be willing to have rights-based conversations. And I think that's the other challenging thing for a lot of folks who are not accustomed to having those kinds of conversations in their line of work. And we have to be careful not to silence rights bearers by saying, oh no, Danika, this is a technical conversation. It really has nothing to do with rights. But for Indigenous peoples, in fact, it does. In fact, it does have to do with rights almost all the time. And part of that is because of colonization, and it's because of this concept that the land is empty and somehow we don't exist for the purposes of certain conversations around conservation, protection, or nature-based solutions. And that we have to be able to exercise our systems with integrity without needing them to have some kind of external validation in order to be allowed to function properly. And so I really sincerely appreciated the broad spectrum of perspectives that you heard from different regions of Canada. I think there was a wonderful panel, and we have at least 15 minutes, I believe, for Q&A. So mics are empty now. Please don't be afraid. ask good questions, ask questions that you think are maybe obvious questions. Just please come up and have a dialogue with these Indigenous peoples, because this is a really amazing opportunity to interact with a group of people who have sort of deep knowledge in these different various fields that they've presented. So I'll go to the first mic over here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Sam. I'm curious if any of you could speak to the difference between, from your perspective, the difference between nature-based solutions as a tool versus a nature-based mindset or worldview from which tools can be derived. And maybe anything you're noticing from this summit so far that relates to that as well.
It is on. Thank you, Sam, for your question. I've noticed that the language within this conference, after Stephen spoke yesterday with his very powerful words about building a relationship with the land relationship plans, and yet the very next panel kept talking about commodity-based mindsets, having that consumerism and capitalism mindset moving forward. That's what I noticed within this, and we have to learn how to reconcile that. We have to learn how to really, as my Alberta government likes to say, we have to learn how to stay in our own lane. But what does that mean, and what does that look like? I personally would say that looks like really engaging with localized knowledge in your own home areas, looking at localized circular economies, really having that conversation with your own people and saying, what does that look like? There's no one on this stage that can tell you what that's going to look like all over Canada, which is exactly what Danika was just talking about. We can't expect Indigenous people, us three, to represent Indigenous people across Canada. I can only say I'm representing my own department, my own division. There are grassroots people in every reserve who still hold on to this knowledge, who wouldn't be seen at places like this. Those are the people that have to be invited to the conversation if we want to start stoking our own mindsets towards nature-based mindsets.
For me, I don't think that nature-based solutions is a new concept. I actually think that this is, for me, a translation for traditional knowledge. And I think that First Nations that, you know, coming from a First Nation that has a very close relationship with the territory and how we've managed resources, how we've managed wildlife, I think those are nature-based solutions. Truly living in harmony with your territory, with your water, with your wildlife, with whatever you harvest from your trapline, those are nature-based solutions. And I do strongly encourage everybody to ensure that a component of cultural information is included in your nature-based solutions, because this information is developed over millennia. You know, we have people that carry traditional knowledge from thousands of years of living in the territory, of seeing how the territory changed. So if you truly want to ensure that your nature-based solutions are best carried out with scientific information that is going to, I believe, have a greater rate of success, include Aboriginal people and Indigenous people in that discussion, because their relationship, I really see Indigenous people as people that are on the front line, that are seeing changes very quickly, that are seeing wildlife taste different, that are seeing water flow differently or have less access to water. These people can really give you feedback that is happening in real time. So to me, nature-based solutions is really focused on cultural information.
Okay, we'll go from this mic here, please.
Hi, I'm Michelle Cantor with Carolina, Canada, and we do have partnerships with local Indigenous One of the questions, or one of the things I wanted to ask you, I studied wildlife biology. I learned how to deconstruct the landscape into woodlands, wetlands, a bunch of different ELC categories, lots of animal population statistics. So when we did a renewing or reviewing of our strategy a couple years ago, the one landscape approach came out. And to us, that was completely liberating in a way, because how much effort do we need to put into deconstructing the landscape versus putting it back together? So we actually switched our whole strategy towards that, and we really looked to Indigenous communities to help guide us. But one thing that came out over about 5 years of consultation and looking at recovery strategies for 1/3 of Canada's species at risk, drinking water for 11 million people that we're stewarding, air for 25% of Canadians that lived in our area. It's a really fragmented landscape, very complex, but the one point of intersection that seemed to be common to everything, including reconciliation, was native plants. And whether it's a woodland plant, a wetland plant, a grassland, and what that does, that was very liberating too, in that suddenly we don't have to tell people how to create landscapes. We can just build relationships with native plants. And I'm wondering how, in the work that you do, native plants resonate as a way to engage people in actually healing the landscape. Do you find that a useful concept instead of focusing on habitats?
Thanks for that question. In the interest of time, I'm going to allow a few other people to ask their questions, and then we'll have the speakers wrap up. So we'll go to this mic, and then you'll be the final question on that side.
My name is Mary Kate Craig. I'm from Manwatan. I have a question really about the governance arrangements that would be needed in order for nature-based solutions such as carbon offsets to become Indigenous-led carbon offsets in Canada. So I don't know if each of you can speak to that. I know for Coastal First Nations, you have an atmospheric benefit agreement that's been signed that has allowed these carbon offsets to be created. But as far as I know, this hasn't happened in any other province in Canada, and atmospheric benefit agreements at the moment don't exist elsewhere. So what would need to happen in order for Indigenous-led nature-based solutions in the form of carbon offsets to rapidly mobilize across Canada?
And last question to you.
Well, sorry, maybe someone else would come up because I had a feeling Mary Kate and I would have the same question, which is, and I was also wondering, about so this balance between, okay, let's not further commoditize nature, yet at the same time, governance is a really clear issue, and rights, and specifically on the atmospheric rights, and how can we put forward. I think people have talked a lot about, revenue and benefits to First Nations, but if you don't actually have the rights to things like atmospheric benefits, how is that possible? So.
Okay, thank you. We'll start with Paul.
Maybe linking to the previous questions too, I appreciate the conference, and it seems the flavor of the day that we use nature in the title, and that's not a knock on it. It's just that I think we have to be careful that we latch on to things as human beings, and I think we need integrative approaches across the board, and maybe leave it at that. In terms of the carbon world, and maybe thinking through, there is no magic in carbon credits. In fact, speaking to some of the elders, they kind of just shake their heads and say, we don't have a clue what the hell you guys are talking about, but if it brings some revenue in, good on you guys. But the critical would say, what, it's a license to pollute? The others would say, this just seems so artificial. And yet, Mary Kate and the question that was asked, you need governments to engage. It very much is using the best of nature, if you will, trees, and leaving them standing instead of cutting them down. But you need agreements amongst governments, the Indigenous governments and senior governments, to say, let's make this happen. And this atmospheric benefit, the ABSAs, there's nothing magical, they're agreements. And you need to get to that point of a government-to-government agreement on how you're going to reconcile, how you're going to generate revenue, how you're going to sequester carbon. It very much is that engagement. I'll leave it at that.
Diandra?
Thank you. I want to answer Michelle's, and I want to get into the governance question. So, Michelle, when it comes to plants, that is, at least for our environment division, that is what we decided that we were going to commit to. As an adaptation to climate change, food security is a huge issue on our reserve. Being in the grasslands, just being on the reserve, it's so hard to buy vegetables. They're so expensive. Vegetables and fruit, fresh produce. We have our own marketplace on our reserve, and it's still just expensive. How are we expecting to have a healthy population with these kinds of barriers put in our place? And we're also seeing that there's still a lot of health issues due to colonization, due to residential schools. A lot of, there was malnutrition, and then also the addiction to sugar and to alcohol. There's a lot of diabetes and just a lot of really big health issues on First Nations reserves that people are seeing now. If we can return back to our traditional foods, like yampa, like buffalo, our traditional roots, if we can return back to that, we have a longer lifespan. We have a little bit more health, which is really great. So I hope that kind of answered your question with that intersectionality, just how everything connects. Looking at the past of colonization, though we were disconnected from our land, we're still here. We're still with the land. When it comes to the governance question and this balance, I think this conference right now challenges us to not just be balanced. We don't have to just, like you said, put in carbon credits and pollute. We have this challenge and this opportunity to lead in sequestering carbon. We have this opportunity to lead in really pushing for nature, valuing it for its inherent rights and for its commodity rights. What does that look like? A lot of Indigenous people are saying land back, land back. And that's going to look different within every community, for every First Nation. For all the grassroots people, it's going to look very different across Canada. But at the same time, it's also a really huge opportunity for every single one of us in this room to partner up. Like you said, there's going to be elders and there's going to be people who don't even know what the heck a carbon tax credit is. They just know that it makes our gas price go up, right? But there are very technical people in this room or people in your lives who would be beneficial for these communities. Yeah, thank you.
I'll try to briefly speak to the two questions. My nation, we're in Quebec, we're extremely different. We have a very close relationship with our provincial government. We do administer many of our programs. So I've seen over the last 10 years a transition to really trying to focus on bringing back, I'm not going to say bringing back, but continuing to emphasize the importance of traditional knowledge, especially in the classrooms and in health. So we have programs now where, there's information around Labrador tea, what it can do, the health benefits, the impact on diabetes. There's now kits given out to young mothers that include dried cedar for diaper rashes, things like that. So we do have information on that, and I think those native plants are some of the areas that the Crees focus on. In terms of governance, Quebec is having a unique approach to carbon credit. So when I went to BC and saw their programs, I thought that was amazing. We have different land categories in my nation. So category 1, which belongs exclusively to the community, and category 2, which we govern, and then category 3, we govern with our municipalities within our nation's territory. We have the opportunity to carbon credit some projects, but this is very new. We're working with our local leadership in each community to try to develop the concept of carbon credit and including that in their development plans. So I hope to see that becoming a more active file in our territory in the future.
Thank you so much to our panel, and thank you to the audience for being so attentive.